Hello again, everybody. Today I want to foreground a few themes that I think are important in the play and that are worth thinking about. And then I want to talk to you about gender specifically in this lecture. So the themes are firstly this idea of the island as a utopia, which comes from a Greek word that actually means no place, a place that doesn't exist. And a utopia, I guess, is a kind of an escape from the ordinary everyday world with all its faults. It's an escape from history, and in some ways we can read Prospero's Island as a utopian space. But at the same time, if it's Prospero's utopia, it's also a dystopia, which is the opposite of a utopia, a good place. In some ways, I guess, it's Caliban's dystopia. In some ways, as a place of exile from culture and from history, we could even say that it's a dystopia for Prospero as well. So what the play does is to trouble that distinction between a utopia and a dystopia. It leaves us with a kind of a question. Are we looking at a utopian or a dystopian reality? The second idea that I think is important to pursue when we think about the play relates to power and ideology. Is the play justifying a particular form of power? And perhaps from our vantage point in the 21st century, we can call it a colonial kind of power. Because in many ways, Prospero is a colonist, even if he's an unwilling colonist who arrives on an island and enslaves the inhabitants that he finds there, after supposedly trying to civilize them, right? This is the language of colonialism. So is the play offering us a justification of this kind of logic? And many people have read it in this way. In fact, many colonists in the 17th and 18th and even 19th centuries have pointed to Shakespeare's play in order to justify what they were doing. Or is the play offering us a kind of a description of a particular form of power? In other words, is it giving us a cross-section? Is it performing a kind of autopsy on power and the way it works? Or is the play in fact critical of the organization of power that we find on this island? So is there an element of the play that levels a critique against Prospero and the way in which he exercises his authority on the island? It's a very difficult question to answer. And of course, maybe it's a bit of a cop-out, but one could say that in some ways he does all of these things. And perhaps it also depends on the kind of lens that you use to interpret the play. A third important idea relates to what I would call containment. In other words, the production and use of subversion. So this relates to this question of power. What do I mean by this? Well, sometimes power works by producing its own infraction. And in fact, this has been masterfully analyzed by the philosopher and historian Michel Foucault. Foucault would say, for instance, if you were at a school that believed in this idea of discipline, you'd know that you were constantly monitored to see that your hair was the right length and style, that your top button was done up, that you were wearing your school blazer when you were supposed to, and so on and so on. I certainly attended a school like that. Foucault would say that these forms of discipline are not in any way significant in and of themselves, right? They exist at a purely formal level with the understanding that they will be broken, and thereby they necessitate a kind of a culture of surveillance and of correction. You know, when you're made to cut your hair or button your shirt properly, the authority of the school over your body is publicly reinforced. And this can only work if you actually break the rules. You know, it's a kind of a game with a predetermined outcome. Your rebellious energies are channeled in a way that actually galvanizes the operation of power. The moment a rule is articulated, it becomes possible to break it. You know, the rules that you really can't break are not articulated. They're radically taboo, so you can't even speak them. You know, there's no rule that says, do not mug your teacher in the bathroom, because it's literally unthinkable. And the moment you have a rule like that, people are going to think, oh, mug the teacher in the bathroom. Why should I not do that? And someone's bound to try it. You know, because to present the rule produces the possibility of its infraction. The cultural critic Slavoj Zizek pointed out that the same thing applies to the 10 Commandments in the Bible. You know, do not cheat on your spouse, don't swear, don't covet other people's stuff, honor the Sabbath. Well, you know, basically committing adultery and using the Lord's name in vain and wanting your neighbor's things and so on pretty much describes a normal Wednesday afternoon in Stellenbosch, right? The one commandment, and this is Zizek's point again, the one commandment that's not articulated is do not sleep with your mother. This is truly forbidden because the incest taboo is fundamental to social organization. Without it, society would collapse. So to bring it back to the Tempest, you know, Prospero forbids Miranda to talk to Ferdinand, even though he actually wants her to disobey him. He allows Caliban to plot against his life because he wants to make an example of him and so on. So all the transgressions that we find in the play are secretly part of Prospero's plan. And they work in service of his power on the island. And then finally, and this is something that I will talk about extensively in the last lecture, not in this one, there's this idea of the construction of Caliban as an other with a capital O. And the way in which the play represents Caliban's own experience of his alterity. I'm just going to put these things on the screen for you for a moment so that you can see them. Alright, there you go. The island is utopia, an escape from history, power and ideology. Does the play justify, describe or criticize? Containment, the production and use of subversion, which I explained by way of Foucault, and then the construction of Caliban as other and Caliban's own experience of his otherness. One of the interesting things about The Tempest is that it's a play that has been rewritten and reinterpreted very often. So there are very many rewrites of The Tempest. And people have especially appropriated The Tempest to critique colonialism, both in stage interpretations and in rewrites such as this one by the Martinican writer Aimé Césaire. and yeah, he called his version A Tempest, and you can see Caliban does not look monstrous in his rewriting, which he published in 1968. Now, to reinterpret the Tempest in this way is not entirely misguided, because it was in fact written at the very beginning of the colonial drive in Europe, the early 17th century. So increasingly, in the time that Shakespeare wrote the play, Europeans were becoming interested in settling in new lands, and they also needed slave labor to feed the new hunger for sugar in Europe. So by the end of the 16th century, the transatlantic slave trade had already been established. And we'll talk about that a bit more. Another interesting rewrite of the Tempest is Margaret Atwood's book, Hagseed. Sorry, I see it's cut off there a little bit. Margaret Atwood wrote The Handmaid's Tale, which they made the TV series of. And this is a wonderful rewrite of The Tempest, if you're interested. Published quite recently. And it's set in a contemporary prison. So one of the things that Atwood does is to foreground the importance of the idea of imprisonment. And she also offers a wonderful interpretation of the Tempest. In fact, if you want to be able to write a brilliant essay about the Tempest, I'd say just read Margaret Atwood's book. It's a lot of fun, it's a great story, and she also unpacks the play in a really compelling and interesting way. All right, but one could argue that the Tempest's representation of gender remains an obstacle to its critical or its emancipatory politics. What do I mean by this? Well, it seems that if we're sympathetic to Miranda, we can't be sympathetic towards Caliban, right? Caliban tried to rape Miranda. And if we feel sympathy towards Caliban, we have to ignore Miranda's claim that Caliban tried to rape her. So if we glamorize Caliban in some way, we have to silence Miranda. And if we take Miranda seriously as a woman, then we have to accept that there is something violent and disturbing about Caliban. And I would say that this remains a problem, especially for modern attempts to try to use the Tempest to critique colonialism. So here are just two quotes, kind of echoing what I just said. The one by Ania Lumba, the representation of gender in the Tempest marks the limits for its appropriation in the third world context today. And Elizabeth Byrne, the Tempest figures colonialism as a relationship between men. And what she's saying here is that women are marginalized in the Tempest, and trying to appropriate the play to make it speak about colonialism feeds into this idea that anti-colonial struggles involve men and that women do not play an important role. So let's talk a bit about the status of women in the Renaissance when Shakespeare wrote the play. They hardly ever held public office. They had value predominantly as a kind of a thing to be traded between two families, and marriages were usually arranged. You see this in the language that Prospero uses about Miranda. He describes her almost as an object, or as a gift that he gives to Ferdinand. And it is an arranged marriage, even though he leads Miranda to think that it's something that she's freely choosing. It was perfectly normal for girls as young as 14 to marry. 12 was in fact the legal age for marriage, if I remember correctly. Juliet's nurse in Romeo and Juliet was married when she was 12. Juliet herself is years old in the play. And, politics in the era often revolved around marriages between powerful families. Divorce was only possible through an act of parliament. That's kind of amazing. You could only get divorced if parliament passed an act allowing it in your specific case. Wealthy women sometimes had tutors, but there were no formal schools for women, and they certainly couldn't attend university. Titles passed from father to son. Wife beatings were common. They were accepted. They were even encouraged, because the control of women by their husband was coded into social custom and law. Women could not inherit property. It had to go to the nearest male heir. Widows, however, could own property and run businesses. And single women, poor women, marginal women were frequently accused of witchcraft and hanged. In fact, there was a hysteria about witches during Elizabeth's reign in England. And it's interesting, often during times of great social change, you find that witchcraft accusations pop up. As recently as in the 1990s in South Africa, there was a resurgence of witchcraft accusations during our own transition to democracy. There were these grotesque punishments that were meted out to women. There's a picture of a ducking chair, which was something that you found in Elizabethan England. It was a punishment for women whose speech was considered too brash or brazen or too free. So the ducking stool was a wooden chair attached to a large lever system, and the lever allowed the chair to be raised or lowered without the tipping of the chair, making it parallel to the ground at all times. So the chair was then lowered into the water, as you see on the picture, dunking the loose-tongued woman under the water. And based on the level of the offense and the cruelty of the deciding party, the woman could be ducked any number of times. And in some cases, the women could drown from the time spent underwater. So this anxiety around women's speech is something that comes up a lot. And you see it also in the scold's bridle. That's a real old bridle, which was a device used to control and humiliate and punish gossiping, troublesome women by effectively gagging them. The word scold comes from the common scold, a public nuisance, more often than not women who habitually gossiped and quarreled with their neighbors. And this device could be really uncomfortable and painful or even tortuous, and scarring of the tongue was not uncommon. Some of them had a bell secured to a spring which was attached to the bridle so that the wearer could be heard as she approached. Yet again, the violence is inflicted on women's bodies, but also directed at their speech, which was considered dangerous in some way. So we could say that in order to tell its story, the Tempest has to silence Miranda. She becomes an object of exchange. The question doesn't seem to be who she wants, but who should have her. And this is actually quite interesting given the power that women have in some of Shakespeare's other plays. For instance, Romeo and Juliet. Juliet refuses this role of the courtly lady, which Miranda plays so well. The wonderful thing about Romeo and Juliet is at the beginning, Romeo tries to treat her in this courtly Petrarchan way. The balcony scene, he's praising her, he's talking about how he's suffering, he's placing her on a pedestal. He's sort of continuing the kind of language that he used with Rosalind, who's the woman he's in love with before he meets Juliet. And Juliet amazingly basically says to Romeo, just shut up and come upstairs and kiss me. So she's a fantastic female figure who arrests the language of Petrarchan love and presents herself not as some kind of ideal but as a real flesh and blood woman. So Romeo is actually quite taken aback. He's almost surprised by Juliet's agency. So Miranda is not a typical Shakespearean woman, really. So this courtly love that I'm talking about was supposed to be spiritually ennobling and not really erotic. In fact, it kind of contained the erotic in a highly ritualized, culturally coded performance of love. The lady was supposed to be unattainable, and a courtly lover also serves his lady, which explains why Ferdinand is so pleased to carry wood for Prospero, because it places him in this position of the courtly lover. In fact, it's really Prospero who takes great pains to ensure that Ferdinand and Miranda should fulfill his courtly ideal. And you see that also in his anxiety about sex before marriage. So he wants to sustain the kind of desexualized courtly relationship that he instates, even though one gets the feeling that Miranda just wants to jump Ferdinand's bones, right? But I should add that when Shakespeare was writing The Tempest, this courtly ideal that we've been talking about was on the wane. And the general status of women in Europe and in England was actually improving. Miranda is a kind of perfect lady, a stereotype, but at the same time women were finding more empowered roles in Elizabethan culture. There were quite a few women who had independent wealth, there were more and more educated and literate women, and of course Queen Elizabeth herself is an example of this new status that women were beginning to enjoy. But they were still very much under their husband's control. They were legally minors, like, you know, the law saw them as children, and they were disenfranchised. So in Shakespeare's plays, desire remains a problem. You know, on the one hand you have a cultural order, and on the other you have the disruptive forces of desire. And The Tempest tries to offer a kind of reconciliation of these two things. The idea of chastity before marriage is a way of dramatizing the subservience of the desires of the body to the laws of culture. And in order to do this, Miranda can't have any agency. Prospero represents the law. There are also no other women, so it becomes difficult for her to articulate an identity outside the patriarchal one. So the Virgin Mary in some ways is the ideal woman, or the ideal woman figure, who is both a mother and a virgin. So it's a kind of an impossible ideal that women have to try to live up to. You have the idea of chastity and of purity, but at the same time also the veneration of the idea of motherhood. And it's only in the figure of Mary that you find this contraction of both these stereotypes in one figure. In fact, Queen Elizabeth modeled herself in many ways on the Virgin Mary. She was called the Virgin Queen. We're pretty sure she wasn't really a virgin. In fact, we suspect she had quite a few lovers. But the way in which she legitimized her power as a monarch was by drawing on the kind of iconography around Mary. And she also managed to perform and sustain her power by keeping herself looking as young as possible throughout her life to sustain this idea of her virginity. So as she got older, she wore thicker and thicker makeup, and because women tended to follow the fashions of court, especially the Queen, you'll see that as Elizabeth ages, everyone in Elizabethan England wears thicker and thicker makeup, which incidentally was a terrible idea because the makeup was lead-based and caused awful damage to people's skin. But I think I'm starting to digress now. So Elizabeth Burns' idea is that the attraction of the play rests in its patriarchal qualities. So, you know, for 20th century writers who used the play to talk about colonialism, they liked the fact that Miranda was such a silent figure. Liberation movements liked the play because it didn't really offer women a space in the fight against colonialism. So here she says, one of the things that attracted anti-colonialist writers to the Tempest is precisely that it allows for the reading of colonialism as essentially a male struggle. At a time when the nationalist and internationalist politics of anti-colonialism were fiercely patriarchal, she's talking about the 1950s and 1960s, 1970s perhaps, when armed struggle was equated with masculinity, and then she says, as if it weren't still, the Tempest's opposition of Prospero and Caliban made the play the ideal site for the rewriting of what must be seen not as colonization but as the colonization of men. So here she's saying that anti-colonialist writers turned to the Tempest in part because it effaced colonized women as sources of resistance, because it presented colonizing women only as obedient daughters, because it denied solidarity between colonized men and women, between women across race. Now here Lumba is talking about the attempted rape of Miranda, and she says the rape amplifies the doomed dialectic which may be detected in Caliban's ability to curse in the colonizer's tongue. The political effect of Prospero's accusation and Caliban's acceptance is to make the potential revolutionary a rapist, and I have tried to suggest that it is crucially interrelated with the other ways in which Caliban's spaces are limited by the boundaries of colonial discourse. Now, in this reading, Caliban plays the role of the rapist because he's expected to. In other words, she's saying he falls into a kind of a stereotype that was very prevalent in colonial times, that justified the oppression of indigenous people by calling them rapists. And I don't know about you, but for me there's something a bit unsatisfying about this idea, because it forces us to read the allegation as false. It forces us in our own reading to silence Miranda and not to believe her, to say that it's simply the effect of the imposition of a kind of stereotype. So you see what I'm getting at. There's a sort of a complicated dialectic in this play that is very difficult to resolve. It's very difficult to produce a kind of a anti-colonial reading of the play at the same time as you produce a feminist reading of the play. It's almost as if these two readings are radically incompatible. Now, it is in fact interesting that there is something a little bit troubling about Miranda, despite the fact that she's so passive and so subservient and so silent. Prospero controls her very tightly. So first of all, her libido is a disruptive force, right? It's something that Prospero is scared of, that he warns her against. And in fact, generally in the play, femininity seems disruptive. It seems aligned to the earth rather than to the heaven. If you think of the witch Sycorax, for instance, as a kind of embodiment of a frightening and grotesque femininity, almost a feminine archetype. Look at this weird speech, for instance, where Miranda asks Prospero, "Sir, are you not my father?" And Prospero says, you'd expect him to just say yes, right? But instead he gives this complicated answer. "Thy mother was a piece of virtue, and she said thou wast my daughter, and thy father was Duke of Milan, and his only heir and princess. No worse issued." Why answer her in this oblique way? Well, he's reminding her, or he's reminding us, that we have only women's word that our children are our own if we're men. In a patrilineal society, that's quite important. You know, can the men ever be sure that the children are their heirs? They can never know for sure. I mean, your mother knows for sure that you are her child, doesn't she? It would be very strange to ask your mother, "Are you sure that I'm your child?" Because there's this physical, biological connection with the umbilical cord. I promise you, your mother knows that she's your mother. But unless you've done a DNA test, which was not possible in Elizabethan England, the only way in which you could know that your father is your father is because you have your father's name. The name, the signifier, almost becomes a replacement of the umbilical cord that draws women into language, and at the same time confers legitimacy on the bond between a father and his child, a father and his daughter in this case. So for Shakespeare, or at least for Prospero, there's something about femininity that potentially thwarts the idea of order, certainty, and most importantly, proper inheritance. You know, all the cornerstones of patriarchal rationality. And it also demonstrates the relationship between naming and patriarchal law. Words which are associated with male rule replace the female body as a kind of guarantor of succession, which is important also for the transmittance of titles and property, which are also important issues in this play. Here we have Enia Lumba talking about the loneliness of Miranda. She says Miranda is the most solitary of Renaissance women protagonists and moves on an exclusively male stage. "I do not know one of my sex, no woman's face remember," she says. These are really sad lines. Where references are made to only 3 other women, she indicates the apparent exclusion of women from the colonial arena, but at the same time the actual and sinister inclusion, together with other images of femininity in the play, provides the ideological legitimation of each of Prospero's actions. At the beginning of the play, he tells her that his art is prompted by his concern for her. He says, "I've done nothing but in care of thee." And next in the same scene, he claims that his enslavement of Caliban was prompted by the latter's attempted rape of Miranda. So she becomes really important to his own justification for the enslavement of Caliban and his, if you want to call it that, his colonial project in general. So to summarize, it seems that we have to choose, either The Tempest is an anti-colonialist play, in which case we have to say that Miranda was lying about her attempted rape, or we have to say that the fact that she was almost raped is unimportant. To read the play as an early indictment of the logic of colonialism compels us to disregard and disempower Miranda. Alternatively, we can read the play with sympathy for Miranda, in which case we're compelled to take the charge against Caliban seriously and see him as a savage who deserves to have his freedom removed for trying to rob Miranda of agency over her body, and for violating the cultural codes that try to protect her in a social context where women are very vulnerable. And I think the fact that these readings are incompatible reveal an ideological fissure that runs through the play. You know, one of the ideological problems that we've inherited from the Renaissance is that the struggle for women's rights has always been represented as incompatible with the struggle against colonialism. And Shakespeare kind of echoes this logic in his plays, or maybe we should say he anticipates this logic, but of course also shows us how we arrive at such an impasse. And the play is disturbing precisely because it never really resolves this inherent contradiction. Right, so that's it for this lecture. In the next lecture, I am going to talk to you about Caliban and the role that he plays in the Tempest specifically. Bye!